Glad to be joined next by Olivia Kuan from Houston, Texas. And it's good to see you, Olivia.
Good to see you. Thank you for having me.
It's our pleasure. And we're going to be talking about the Hurricanes, Herricanes. And it's about a 1970s all women full tackle football team. And in the 1970s, that was it's unusual now, full
Yeah.
tackle type stuff, right? Uh, and that's Houston. And people
hmm
may know that there was a football team there earlier, which is now in Nashville. It's the Houston Oilers of Nashville. And so I suppose that you're a Texans fan. But there's just, when we talk about women's sports, we're in the midst of the Women's College World Series, Softball World Series here in Oklahoma City right now, which is
hmm
blowing up. I mean, absolutely the biggest thing in the country right now. And so, welcome to this discussion on Dead Center Films. Give us an idea about your background and how you came to want to do a documentary about a 1970s football team that was full tackle and way ahead of its time.
Yeah. Yeah. So I actually, my mom played for the Houston Hurricanes, which gave me a background from childhood of having this idea that women played football and that that was normal in my world. And it wasn't until I got older that I started to realize that it wasn't normal and it was actually quite unusual. So in my adult life, I started looking further into it and realized that this league that my mom played in the 70s was actually the first of its kind. It was the first full tackle women's football league to ever exist. And this kind of was coming at a moment where Title IX was being passed, and there was a kind of a reckoning happening as far as women's rights and especially women's sports. So it kind of all lined up it to be this historic moment. And even though the women who played in that team in that league, um, that didn't turn into this long-lasting, groundbreaking event that everyone's watching women's football, but that idea was planted in our culture, in our society, and it's been passed down through generations. And as you mentioned before, now we have women's softball being broadcast on national television, which is so new. Like when did women's sports actually get a audience on television before this? It's only been a few years. It started with the Women's World Cup, and now we're doing this, and it's progress is happening. It's slow, but it's happening.
Yeah, Clemson, the Sooners, just in a super regional defeated Clemson. Clemson's only had women's softball for 4 years. I
hmm
mean, that's how fast this has blown up. And we were watching, I think most of us of my vintage watched, which I think happened at the Astrodome in the 1970s, was when Billie Jean King defeated Bobby Riggs. I think that was at the Astrodome.
Yes, it was.
And so we see these sorts of things in our own lifetimes. And you said your mom played in this, but obviously to do full contact women's football in the 1970s, there probably was a lot of roadblocks.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it was a lot of financial roadblocks where they couldn't get any sort of sponsors, so they were all paying for their own uniforms, paying for facilities, and even though it was a professional league, they weren't. They were making negative money, So, um, and then furthermore, there was a social aspect to it. Like there were a lot of women who just didn't tell people around them that they were playing football because it was considered peculiar or odd or just unfeminine. So it was kind of, for some of them, it was something they did behind closed doors, and they just loved the game so much they were willing to sacrifice things in their personal life to make it happen.
The So you grew up with this memory. What was it that made you want to share this via a documentary and tell the world about it?
Um, I mean, there's a little bit of frustration on my part, as I was telling people throughout my life that my mom played football. It was largely met with disbelief or just some sort of minimizing, like, oh, it must have been like powder puff or something like that. But no, this was real, legitimate, full tackle professional football. And I guess I just wanted to share that with the world, not only just to set the record straight for my mom's sake and for her teammates' sake, but also just I grew up with a particular perspective that this was possible. And it is possible. So I feel like the more that people understand that anything is possible, the more that they can expand what is the possibility in their own lives as far as making themselves feel strong and powerful.
I'm sure that when people think back about the 70s in football and Houston, the Oilers and the Steelers, their legendary battles, a lot of those men are sick,
Mhm.
handicapped in some way, either brain injuries or their limbs. I don't suppose there's any health care or pensions or anything helping the women who were in the professional football league at the time.
No, no, there's nothing of that sort. And fortunately, most of them don't claim to have any substantial lasting injuries, whether it be brain injuries or otherwise, that have really affected their lives. Um, but, Dan Pastorini appears in our film, and he has this whole campaign going on, which we don't cover in the film, but I think it's fascinating that even the players playing in the NFL in the 70s, their pensions and healthcare is not nearly what it is for the players who are retiring today. And he's making an effort to try and get the old timers from the 70s to have their medical costs covered for things that we now know are very serious medical conditions.
There had to be in your research on this particular film, obviously having your mother and her teammates, were there any heroes back then in terms of, you just mentioned Title IX and Billie Jean King back in the 70s? Any in your research as you got started doing this, any sort of heroes that emerge as to, people that are pioneers doing things for women's sports?
Yeah, I mean, there's quite a few people that we cover in the film. Billie Jean King is absolutely one of them. We cover the Battle of the Sexes and how I mean, that was happening basically the same time as Title IX and when this league started. And so, furthermore, there's the people who actually, like the political side, where people were working to get Title IX passed. And even after Title IX was passed, there was a long 20-year road to actually make it implemented and make it make sense for institutions and get it to where it is today and what we recognize it to be now, where as this champion of women's sports. Um, but that took time. That took a lot of effort and a lot of people championing that cause and that thought process. And as far as women's football specifically, more recently, there's a incredible woman called Dr. Jen Welter, who was the first woman to hold a coaching position in the NFL. And she is a prominent part of our film and has been championing women in the sport, not only at the coaching level, but on the playing level and also behind the scenes in the management level. And she's even started a camp for young girls to give them some early exposure to football, because young girls do not really have a chance to play football in elementary school, middle school. So has a traveling camp called Gridiron Girls, which goes around the country and offers a flag football intensive opportunity for girls. And of course, all males and other genders are welcome as well.
Anything from your research and doing your documentary that applies to, as you just spoke to, the pioneers and things that are happening now, but anything beyond the sports realm in terms of public policy, things of that nature that you discovered that people need to be made aware of?
Well, I think that people need to be made aware of the limitations of Title IX. Like Title IX specifically applies to educational institutions that receive federal funding. So that's uh, colleges, but only the ones that are not private, and that's high schools and other public schools. So private schools are pretty much, they don't really have to follow Title IX. And there's also different caveats within Title IX that doesn't mean that you are going to definitely get an equal playing field. Like one of the ones we point out is that there's a test within Title IX where you're supposed to prove that you've met the interests and abilities of women. And that's one that can easily be used as a loophole to say that, well, women don't want to play football. We don't have a ton of kids pounding on our doors saying we want to play football. So we've met the interest, we've met the demand, and this problem is solved. So just that's the main thing, is just to be aware that there is still room to grow in these policies that we've established in the 1970s. And I think that we are going in the right direction.
So from this journey and coming to film festival, and by the way, I should ask at this point, do you know when your movie is going to be screened at Dead Center?
Yeah, so we're showing at the Dead Center Film Festival in Oklahoma City at 5:30 this Saturday. I don't remember the date, but 5:30 on Saturday and 3 p.m. on Sunday.
So what's next? This is obviously going to be a hit, and people are going to want to know more about this. And people, when they start seeing things like this, Olivia, they start going, I want to know more about that. I want to know more what happened to these people. And people that don't know history and they discover something that's seemingly obscure, then they really start digging into it. So for you, where do you go next?
For me personally, I hope that this film gets a distribution so that the word about women's football is spread across the country. And I'm a filmmaker, so I'm kind of ready to move on to the next thing. I feel like I've explored what I wanted to explore in the world of women's football, and I'm happy to share it with the world now. For those who are interested in knowing more, there are two women's football leagues in the United States right now, the WFA and the WNFC, and they both have nationwide leagues that are playing probably in your city, and they play full tackle 11-on-11 football. So if you're interested in checking them out, please do.
Michelle, Olivia Kuan is the director of Hurricane, HERRICANES, and her mom was on that, and she's an independent filmmaker that made this documentary. I'm looking forward to seeing it, and I just think that it's just something that's going to open a lot of doors for people and start looking at, as you mentioned, people that were doing these things in the 70s were pioneers and weren't always treated the greatest, sometimes badly. Right?
Yeah, for sure. And since you're in Oklahoma, I will point out that Oklahoma has a strong legacy of women's football. The Oklahoma City Dolls were champions of the league in the 1970s and actually had more support than the Houston Herricanes did back in Houston. So the city of Oklahoma City has a legacy of supporting women in this sport. And I believe that the current women's football team in Oklahoma recently won the championship as well. So,
all right, I know some people are going to start digging into that history. So, Olivia Kuan, the Hurricanes, we look forward to seeing this, and best of luck to you in the future.
Thank you. Thank you so much.